Thank you for joining us this afternoon and this morning for those on the West Coast. My name is Todd Harrison. I am the president of the Organic and Natural Health Association and a partner at Venable LLP. Today, we bring to you the power of vitamin D, facing a pandemic proactively. These have been trying past 9 to 10 months in our country, and we continue to face uncertainty for the next 6 months to probably a few years. While a vaccine seems to be in the horizon, there will be 50 to 60% of this country that will not take that vaccine. And what to do for those individuals? I've always said that your best defense is always an offense. And the one thing we continue to ignore in our healthcare system is rather than keeping people healthy, we provide them a silver bullet or a pill or something along that lines to once they get ill. However, more and more studies are starting to show that vitamin D is a powerful ally in our fight against COVID, along with other potential nutritional ingredients such as zinc and quercetin and vitamin C. These remain largely undiscussed in the public square because oftentimes people are labeled quackery for whatever reason. Yet we still know, and still true today, that 80% of all diseases, including chronic diseases, can be avoided through proper nutrition and a healthy lifestyle. But we do not preach that. It's a sad commentary on our society and our government that they're unable to wrap their heads around that nutritional choices in our lives matter. And it does matter in the face of a pandemic. The fact is, the healthier you are to begin with, the less likely that you're going to have a severe reaction. No, it's not a silver bullet. And whether you decide to take a vaccine or not, these are mitigation strategies that we can all, throughout this country, use. It is not quackery. And we must start training our government officials to stop always looking for silver bullets, because as a country as a whole, over the last 40 years, we have gotten more unhealthy, not healthier. Drugs are important. They can be life-saving. However, if you want to lower healthcare costs and fight a pandemic, the healthier your population is to begin with, the more likely that you will survive the severe consequences of a particular disease. So we appreciate you taking the time to be with us today. And I will now hand it over to Karen, who is the Executive Director of the Organic and Health Natural Association. And she will introduce our speakers. Thank you.
Thank you, Todd, so much. And I really do appreciate everyone who's joining in on this. It's a very important topic, as Todd has said. I'm going to move quickly through introductions because we have a lot of really wonderful ground to cover. It's my pleasure to introduce James DeNicola-Antonio, who is a doctor of pharmacy and cardiovascular research scientist, currently serving as the Director of Scientific Affairs for AIDP. He's authored or co-authored more than 250 medical publications, as well as 4 best-selling books: The Salt Fix, Superfuel, The Longevity Solution, and The Immunity Fix. His body of work is focused on nutrition deficiencies, and nutraceuticals. James has also recently accepted our invitation to join in as part of the Scientific Advisory Council for ONN. James, I turn it over to you.
Thanks, Karen. And Todd, that was a great introduction as well. Thank you for that. I know that this is mainly about vitamin D, but I wanted to talk about some other supplements, and then I'll get more into vitamin D. And really what I'm going to just kind of go over is the clinical evidence in humans on nutrients and nutraceuticals around immunity, and talk about dosing and a little dive into the studies a little bit deeper. So this was a meta-analysis of clinical studies in humans looking at reductions in the severity of the common cold with vitamin C. Now, what you can see here is that when you give 1 gram of vitamin C, there's about 7% reduction in the severity of the common cold. But if you go up to 4 grams, and this is in adults, there's about 3 times greater efficacy in regards to reducing the severity of the common cold. Now, the dashed lines is what's called linear regression. So essentially, the points, the circles and the squares are actually from clinical trials. And the dashed lines are sort of hypothetical using linear regression on if we increase the dose based on the increased benefit going from 1 to 4 grams, what could potentially lead to a 50% reduction in the severity of the common cold. And what we see here in adults is 10 grams of vitamin C may lead to a 50% reduction in the severity of the common cold. For children, we see this similar dose response where 1 gram of vitamin C in children leads to a 13% reduction in the severity of the common cold, whereas 2 grams leads to a 2-fold increased benefit. And again, linear regression would suggest that 4 grams would potentially lead to a 50% reduction in the severity of the common cold. And this 10 gram may give us that 50% reduction. But again, it's important to stress that is only hypothetical extrapolation. If we look at the duration of the common cold, we see the same thing. I'm going to go backwards here, where potentially 18 grams of vitamin C would lead to a 50% reduction in the duration. And a 3.5 gram dose could potentially lead to a 50% reduction. And we see these, again, these dose responses where if you give more vitamin C, there's a greater reduction in the duration of the common cold compared to lower doses. So essentially, what we have here is really an optimal versus a tolerable intake. So the main reason why I presented this slide is that the current tolerable upper intake for vitamin C is 1.2 grams per day in children, and the optimal dose may sit at 2 to 4 grams in regards to fighting infections. For adults, the tolerable upper limit is 2 grams, although this may be need to be increased. The key here too is that there are people who you shouldn't give doses, high doses of vitamin C all at once. Typically, you want to avoid people who have kidney disease or oxalate kidney stones. You usually don't want to give them more than 1 gram of vitamin C at once. And even in healthy people, the dose should be typically, and how the body works, vitamin C should be given every 2 to 3 hours. So just as we don't consume all our water in one sitting, or we don't breathe all our oxygen in 1 minute, why would you consume all your vitamin C in 1 dose? And really, we should be doing more testing of the safety of vitamin C. It's very safe, and in most instances, the tolerable upper intake is probably inhibiting the greater benefits that we could see if we dosed vitamin C in smaller doses but more frequently. So essentially, it's very likely that if we were to dose 1 gram or less every 2 to 3 hours for a dose of up to, let's say, 6 to 12 grams for an adult, there would be a lot more benefit in regards to viral infections. This is a good meta-analysis showing that just taking acute doses of vitamin C may not be enough, that essentially the benefit is seemingly driven by those who take vitamin C chronically, and then once they get sick, they increase the dose of vitamin C, which makes sense. So what Todd was saying is we want the person to be healthy, and just taking something acutely is never going to give you the same benefits as dosing something chronically and then increasing during, let's say, an acute infection. So the takeaway here is, again, daily vitamin C plus additional doses upon symptom onset has the most evidence, and the frequency should be really every 2 to 3 hours, and the tolerable upper intake for at least healthy people should likely be increased if it's dosed at lower doses and more frequently. Going back into doses again and how we should be dosing zinc. Zinc lozenges, essentially you need to hit 18 milligrams of zinc every 2 hours to get the optimal benefit. Most zinc lozenges are only 13 milligrams. So really the evidence-based dose would be taking, let's say, 2 Zicams or 2 Cold-EEZE. And it should be taken within 24 hours of symptom onset. and it should be taken every 2 hours. And when you do the correct dosing like this, the studies show that it may shorten the common cold by up to 6 to 7 days, essentially eliminating any type of symptoms. And you have to get the daily dose above 75 milligrams. And the problem, again, besides those two branded zinc lozenges that I had mentioned, very few zinc lozenges release what's called ionic zinc, which is the active form of zinc. And this is essentially showing here that in the pH of the mouth, zinc acetate and zinc gluconate have very good absorption. But when you start adding glycine to these zinc lozenges, the absorption dramatically goes down. Here are the clinical studies on zinc lozenges reducing the duration of the common cold. And those are the doses that were used. Essentially, you have to go above 75 milligrams per day. And then this is showing too that really 18 milligrams of ionic zinc is going to give you the most benefit, where you're going to see, anywhere from 6 to 7 day reduction in the duration of the common cold. And as you go lower and lower, here's where most zinc lozenges sit on the market, and you're probably only going to get a 3-day reduction in the duration of the common cold. Again, this is showing as well that the dose needs to be above 75 milligrams per day for there to be a significant benefit in the reduction in the duration of the common cold. Again, these zinc lozenges here, Zicam and Cold-EEZE, based on the clinicals, really 2 lozenges every 2 hours for 3 to 6 doses is the most evidence-based dosing. Taking a step back from lozenges, zinc as a capsule form has been also shown to have significant benefits. In the ARUD study, which is the zinc and age-related eye disease study, this was a randomized controlled trial in approximately 5,000 patients that were 50 to 80 years old. And those who got zinc plus copper had a significant 27% reduction in mortality. What's sort of important from this study as well is if they stopped the trial at 2.5 years, we would have thought that zinc plus copper does not provide any benefit. But because we were lucky enough that this study went out for 7 years, you can see the divergence in the curves and it becoming essentially significant at 3 years. So again, just because the study fails doesn't mean that the substance doesn't work. You have to get the dose right, and you have to look at the population long enough. In regards to zinc capsules in older adults around immunity, this was an excellent randomized double-blind placebo-controlled study in 50 patients, 55 years of age or older. And they gave a total of 45 milligrams of elemental zinc from zinc gluconate, 50 milligrams before breakfast, 30 after dinner. And essentially, those who got zinc had a 70% reduction in total infections. And no one who received zinc had more than 1 infection per year. Whereas those who did not, you can see there was a significant percentage that had more than 1 infection. This is just a quick look to show the studies, clinicals in humans on zinc to prevent infections. It's quite extensive. There's about 8 clinical studies here, plus a meta-analysis of 10 studies. Reduced morbidity, decreased incidence and duration of upper and lower respiratory tract infections. And we see the same benefits here. And this is primarily upper and lower respiratory tract infections, but even ventilator-associated pneumonia, common cold as well. In regards to zinc for treatment, we have a similar large data pool from human clinical studies, including 2 meta-analyses, one of 16 studies and one of 7 studies. Again, you want to start within 24 hours. And, there's reductions in even hospital stay in children who get zinc. And here are the dosings and the duration that was given for what type of disease. So to summarize, zinc clearly has antiviral effects in children, adults, and elderly. Good safety profile. You typically want to use copper with zinc, especially at high doses, because zinc can cause copper deficiency. Typically, copper intakes of usually just 1 milligram per maybe 20 to 30 milligrams of zinc seems to be enough. And again, the benefits with zinc seem to be around a 50% reduction in the incidence, severity, and duration of the common cold or respiratory infections. This is black elderberry, and this is also a meta-analysis of randomized controlled trials. This was in 4 clinical studies 3 were in influenza, 1 was in the common cold. I want to stress this was standardized to elderberry. So essentially, if you get elderberry that's just like a juice or is not standardized to a specific amount of anthocyanins, which are the polyphenols in this product, and it's probably not going to work. Typically, the standardization is between 10 and 15% anthocyanins. And this is how we think black elderberry works, is these anthocyanins are converted to something called ferulic acid, which has many anti-inflammatory and antiviral effects. But there's also other compounds, other anthocyanins that seem to have maybe even direct antiviral effects in regards to binding of viruses to cells, getting into the cell, and even potentially viral replication. What you can see here from these 4 human clinicals is that a standardized elderberry extract significantly reduces duration of influenza and colds by anywhere from 2 to 4 days. This was the NACES study. It looked at elderly patients, but also non-elderly patients that had degenerative diseases. And they gave 600 milligrams of N-acetylcysteine, which is the best way to boost glutathione in the body, twice a day. They started this prior to the influenza and cold season, and it was a 6-month randomized controlled multi-center study, again, in almost 300 elderly patients. And essentially, the severity and incidence of influenza illness was cut in half with N-acetylcysteine, and there was approximate 2-day reduction in the duration of influenza as well. This was highly statistically significant. And you can see here the months where N-acetylcysteine at this dose had most of its benefits was really between month 2 and 4 of the cold and flu season. And this is just to show you the significant reductions in the symptoms: this headache, myalgia, arthalgia, sore throat, rhinorrhea, mucus, and cough. Now, let's jump into vitamin D, because I know that's what everyone's mostly here for. So a lot of people think vitamin D is a vitamin. It's technically a prohormone. So our body converts vitamin D to sort of 2 different activated forms. We can produce it through the activation of with sunlight in our skin, or we can get it through diet, but there's limited dietary sources, such as just fish or pastured eggs are really typically your only good dietary sources of vitamin D, which is why about 1 billion people globally are vitamin D deficient, and half the global population is vitamin D insufficient. And essentially, that's the key takeaway, is you have a huge percentage of the population that just simply is not sufficient in this prohormone. Our body also has to activate it to something called calcitriol, and that's what actually binds to the vitamin D receptors and activates over 2,000 genes. And you need magnesium to actually activate vitamin D. So that's important when we're talking about vitamin D supplementation. If someone is deficient in magnesium, you're going to not get as much benefit. So this is just a quick schematic on how we make vitamin D, either through UVB or how we get it through diet or supplements. And then there's these hydroxylase enzymes that require magnesium to convert vitamin D to calcidiol, and then to convert it to the active hormone, calcitriol. And then we even have cells and immune cells that can actually synthesize their own active vitamin D, calcitriol. Colon, prostate, lung cells can do this, but they need magnesium because the same enzymes are needed to do that. This is just a quick graph from Grassroots Health showing, and we've known this for a while now, that essentially as vitamin D levels drop in the winter, you see the increase in influenza. And it's just, there's this, inverse association with lower vitamin D levels and increased incidence of flu. And how does vitamin D actually work? So the active hormone can bind to the vitamin D receptors on almost all immune cells, and this seems to reduce pro-inflammatory cytokine release and increase anti-inflammatory cytokines. It also helps us produce these proteins, these antiviral, antimicrobial proteins called cathelicidins and alpha and beta defensins. And it helps improve tight junctions, which is essentially, may reduce viral entry as well by just improving the health of the cell. Vitamin D also seems to downregulate the receptor that's needed for coronavirus to enter the cells, ACE2 receptors. So it may reduce viral entry, but that's not definitive. There is an increase in oxidative burst in our immune cells that kill pathogens with vitamin D, which is a good thing. Again, it activates over 2,000 genes in vitamin D, including vitamin K dependent proteins, which are important for the elastin health, which is elastin essentially forms these cable networks around our alveoli, allows equal oxygen exchange. So if you calcify that elastin because you have poor vitamin K or vitamin D or magnesium, you just need to activate vitamin D, that can be a problem and potentially lead to worse complications. So what's the actual evidence for vitamin D from the human clinical studies? This BMJ meta-analysis was in 25, it included 25 randomized controlled trials and over 10,000 participants. And essentially, the more deficient you are in vitamin D, the better benefits you get. And essentially, if you're profoundly vitamin D deficient, you only have to treat 4 people to prevent 1 incidence of acute respiratory tract infection. Typically, to give you an example, for a statin in primary prevention to, let's say, prevent a cardiovascular event, typically the number needed to treat is around 100 over 5 years or so. So it just goes to show you that supplementing deficient people with a vitamin is profoundly beneficial. This was another meta-analysis in 11 placebo-controlled trials in over 5,000 patients. And essentially, vitamin D was shown to reduce the risk of respiratory tract infections by 36%. And if you did a once daily dosing versus, let's say, once a week, there was a 50% reduction. So if you dose vitamin D every day, that seems to be better than weekly doses. Quickly on vitamin D and COVID-19. So studies have shown that essentially 80% or more of hospitalized COVID patients have vitamin D deficiency. If you have vitamin D deficiency, which is typically diagnosed at levels below 20 nanograms per ml, the studies have shown that you're twice as likely to test positive for SARS-CoV-2 compared to those who have levels above 55. Again, we had mentioned that this may be due to a reduction in ACE2 receptors or potentially just the increase in cathelicidins, beta defensins. You may not even feel like you get sick if you have more adequate levels of vitamin D. Compared to D levels that are in the sufficient range, 30 to 40 or higher, if you have a D level less than 30, that's been shown to increase the risk of a poor COVID outcome by 2 to 3-fold. And essentially, if you have severe vitamin D deficiency, you're at an almost 15-fold higher risk of dying and 6 times more likely to have a poor COVID outcome. Now, just to put this in perspective, if you are over the age of 60, you are at about a 9-fold higher risk of dying, but you can't control your age. But you certainly can control if you are vitamin D deficient. And that is actually seems to be a worse risk factor than even being elderly. Quickly on some clinical trials actually testing vitamin D in COVID-19 patients. One small randomized controlled trial in BMJ was called the SHADE study. They gave a good dose of vitamin D to actually people who were vitamin D deficient and severely deficient at that. This was 60,000 international units in a nanoliquid for 7 days, and they continued that dosing if the vitamin D level was below 50. And essentially, those who got vitamin D, 3 times as many patients were SARS-CoV-2 negative in the vitamin D group. So essentially, 62% versus 20% were SARS-CoV-2 negative by day 21 if they got the vitamin D. So essentially, it's indicating that this may help you clear the virus quicker. Now, this study many people kind of view this preprint study as a failure, but I want to kind of go into some of the details of this study. This was in 240 hospitalized patients with severe COVID, so much different than the asymptomatic or lightly symptomatic COVID in the previous slide. This is severe COVID-19, and the average day of symptom onset was 10.2 days before they got 1 dose of vitamin D. So instead of dosing vitamin D like we saw for up to 2 weeks, this is just a single dose of vitamin D, and the population wasn't even deficient at baseline in their vitamin D levels. And again, this was very late in the disease course. Even still, mechanical ventilation was cut in half, over half, but it just missed statistical significance. Again, these were in people who weren't even vitamin D deficient at baseline, and it was a single dose, and it was late in the onset. And so it would be expected that vitamin D wouldn't show significant benefits. What's interesting too is the vitamin D group was actually a sicker population at baseline. They had greater amounts of sore throat, indicating worse virus, and they had more diabetes as well. But you can see here still, even with all these sort of things kind of pitted against vitamin D, it still cut mechanical ventilation in half. Again, that did just miss statistical significance. So some promising interventions in COVID-19. There was one small clinical study with calcifediol, which is a partially activated vitamin D analog. And there was a dramatic reduction in percent that ended up in the ICU. I will make a note though that the baseline characteristics were not well matched. There was definitely more of an advantage for the vitamin D analog group. So I think this dramatic, huge reduction in ICU was probably overstated based on the baseline characteristics, but it still goes to show that there may be some benefit. We should do more studies. Glutathione has shown in several case reports to rapidly improve dyspnea in COVID-19 patients. You should always use liposomal because there are issues with absorbing glutathione unless it's liposomal. And then they also added, after doses of just glutathione were shown to lead to good responses, they added also alpha lipoic acid and N-acetylcysteine, which seem to provide good benefits as well. There is a preprint of 1,200 milligrams of alpha lipoic acid given IV, which cut mortality in half in COVID-19 patients. Again, missing statistical significance, however, and that may have been due to the small numbers in that study. Melatonin, we should keep our eyes on. Very safe, substance. We do secrete this in the brain, but we also secrete it throughout the entire day. Doses of up to 1,000 milligrams of melatonin have actually been used in humans with good safety profile. And essentially, the studies are showing that those who supplement with melatonin are at a lower risk of dying. In intubated COVID-19 patients, a huge reduction was found. And this is an associational study. I want to be clear about that, of an 83% reduction. Again, another associational study showing that those who take supplemental melatonin are up to a 50% lower risk of testing positive for SARS-CoV-2. And I can kind of touch on why. And then there was a case series of 10 COVID pneumonia patients that were given 36 to 72 milligrams of melatonin in 4 divided doses. And the average hospital stay compared to similar COVID patients was 5 days less in those who got this higher dosing of melatonin. Mechanical ventilation, none of them who got melatonin required mechanical ventilation or died, whereas a similar population not getting melatonin, essentially 20 to 40%, ended up being on mechanical ventilation and died. Selenium, there's at least 3 human clinicals that it does enhance our innate and adaptive immune system in regards to the cytotoxicity of our immune cells and how well they sort of phagocytize pathogens. There's sort of like this good history on different RNA viruses with selenium that if you're deficient, it can make non-virulent RNA viruses potentially fatal. So essentially, Keyshawn disease is known for populations that are coming from selenium deficient soils. And essentially, Coxsackie virus, which is a non-lethal RNA virus, which can cause hand, foot, and mouth in some children, ends up becoming virulent and induces cardiomyopathy in patients that are selenium deficient. And you simply just treat these people with selenium. So it goes to show you that RNA viruses, which coronavirus is, and looking at past RNA viruses, can take a non-virulent virus and make it virulent simply if you're deficient in just one nutrient. Quercetin has preliminary studies, one study in humans, that 1,000 milligrams a day significantly reduces upper respiratory tract infection incidence in cyclists during a 2-week period. And there are some data with probiotics, prebiotics, and symbiotics from meta-analyses of controlled studies that they improve the immune health, they improve the efficacy of the influenza vaccine, and of course they improve our metabolic health, certain prebiotics, which people with metabolic syndrome are about a 3.5-fold higher risk of dying from COVID and a 4.5-fold higher risk of ending up in the ICU. So essentially, here are the nutrients that are important for supporting the immune system. Highlighted here are the vitamins, the minerals that I discussed: N-acetylcysteine, elderberry, glutathione, alpha-lipoic acid, melatonin, quercetin, probiotics, and prebiotics. And I'm going to give control now over to Roger. Thank you.
Thank you so much, James. That was really amazing. And just for the entire audience, if you want to go ahead and put your questions into the chat, please feel free to do so. Depending on how quickly everyone gets through their presentations, we may have time to get them answered. If not, we'll present them to the speakers and see if we can get a reply. So it's my deep pleasure to be able to introduce Dr. Let me slow down. Dr. Roger Sweltz, who is currently Associate Clinical Professor at the University of California, Riverside School of Medicine, and Assistant Clinical Professor at the School of Medicine and Allied Health at Loma Linda University. He lectures routinely across the country at conferences and for medical PA and RT societies. He's also the co-founder of MedCram, an online offering of medical videos and lectures. Roger, please take control.
Well, thank you very much, Karen. I appreciate that. I also wanted to thank James for just an excellent presentation. I learned quite a bit just listening to you here in the last 5 minutes, so I appreciate that. What I'm going to do is sort of go into a little bit deeper role in the role of vitamin D and the supplementation in COVID-19, and basically go from a sort of a 30,000 foot view to the more deep down studies that we've sort of talked about here briefly. I'm going to see if we can. There we go. All right. So who am I and why should you believe me? I just wanted to give you a little bit of a background about MedCram. There was a recent study that was performed in Europe looking at content on YouTube to see how accurate it was. And they used a Oxford University tool called Discern Instrument. And we were pleasantly surprised when we took 3 out of the top 5 spots on all of YouTube in terms of content and balance. So let's use that and sort of dig deep into this issue of COVID-19. Let's start off with vitamin D. James did a great job talking to you that vitamin D is in fact a prohormone. It has a receptor. It's lipid soluble, so it goes through the membranes and it can bind to its receptor and actually affect transcriptional changes. So it's a very powerful compound. This is not just like a mineral that you happen to have that you need to do a few things. This thing is very wide-reaching. And as you have already seen, we have 2 sources for vitamin D, the sun and also oral. Now, the thing I wanted to draw your attention to is 25-hydroxyvitamin D is what we measure in the serum. And so you're going to be seeing that over and over again, 25-hydroxyvitamin D. Something that you should know, very importantly, you can get confused on this if you're not familiar with it. There are 2 units of measuring this, and you'll see this often. There's the one I prefer, which is the nanograms per milliliter, and that generally shows a deficiency down around 20. You'll see that number. But then there's also the nanomoles per liter, and that's about 2.5 times the nanograms per milliliter. So if you're looking at, for instance, 30 and 75. The 30 would be the nanograms per milliliter, and the 75 would be the nanomoles per liter. So just keep that in mind as we start looking at numbers. Otherwise, you might get a little confused. The other thing I was going to add too, James pointed out very well that magnesium is needed for the activation of its active form 125-dihydroxyvitamin D. Something that you might not be familiar with, but is also very important, is diets high in fructose. High fructose corn syrup, for instance, which is used quite often here in the United States, can inactivate 25-hydroxyvitamin D and 125-hydroxyvitamin D to its inactive form here, the 24-25-dihydroxyvitamin D or the 124-25. So you may get enough sun, you may get enough supplementation, but if you have high levels of fructose in your diet, that will actually work against you at the molecular level. So you have to be careful of that. A lot of studies showing that. So the other issue that we have is the amount of time that we spend outside. Well, recent studies have shown that only 7.6% of where we spend time is outdoors. And so that gives us a very little chance to get the ultraviolet B radiation that we need. And so we know that a major cause of deficiency is inadequate exposure to sunlight. We know there's some other things that we'll talk about that have an association with how much vitamin D you get. You can also lose vitamin D in kidney disease, and we see kidney disease certainly in the hospital in these patients. We've known for more than a century that vitamin D is essential for treatment of diseases, and that if there's a deficiency, it can lead to an increased susceptibility to infection. I think particularly of tuberculosis. We see an increased risk of disease in children with rickets. Interestingly, with tuberculosis, they used to put these sanitariums very high up, high altitude. It was thought that the low oxygen levels helped kill the aerobic Mycobacterium tuberculosis. But on the other side, also realize that the higher in elevation you are, the more ultraviolet B radiation you get, the more vitamin D you make, and that also may explain what we're seeing here as well. Recent studies have shown that provided further evidence of vitamin D as an important regulator of human immune function. So these vitamin D receptors are actually located in immune cells, like monocytes, like neutrophils. And as was mentioned by James, there are a number of antimicrobial peptides which are manufactured and regulated by vitamin D as well. So let's talk a little bit about sort of the 30,000 foot view here of COVID and vitamin D. You know, very early on, we knew that vitamin D production in the skin is reduced by a twofold capacity as you get older. So 77 to 82-year-old subjects revealed that aging can decrease by greater than twofold capacity of the skin to produce vitamin D. So age certainly is a risk factor just in producing vitamin D. We know that in terms of skin color, there is a definite distribution. Here in this graph, you can see here, again, nanograms per milliliter, that if you were to draw a line straight down the middle of this, with the white bars representing white folk and the black bars representing African Americans and the gray bars representing Mexican Americans, you can see here that the white population dominates on these higher vitamin D levels, but we see here that the black and Mexican Americans seem to dominate here on the lower vitamin D levels. And so this was over 8,000 people that were screened and looked at. So certainly we know that vitamin D and skin color can be an issue. And why is that? That's because that the melanin is simply blocking the ultraviolet radiation from getting down into the dermis where vitamin D is manufactured. We also know that there is decreased bioavailability in obesity. So remember, vitamin D is a fat-soluble vitamin. And as such, it is going to be stored in the fat. So the more fat you have, the more vitamin D is unavailable for metabolism in the body. And so with those three in mind, we can look here and we look what is the state of today? Where are we with vitamin D and metabolism? Currently, there's no international consensus. We know that supplementation of vitamin D can lead to a reduction in fractures. There is some data that it could be associated with an increase in myocardial infarctions if you're actually supplementing it. But that study was very interesting in that it was calcium supplementation that caused the modest increase in MI with or without vitamin D. That was in women in a women health study. Typically, they like to target 30 to 40 nanograms per milliliter for fractures, and that targets greater than 150 nanograms per milliliter is associated with hypercalcemia. I'd just pause here and say that there was a study where someone looked at 20,000 patients at the Mayo Clinic, and only one of those 20,000 that were on supplemental vitamin D and had their vitamin D levels checked had hypercalcemia. So it's an extremely rare situation. You know, the Society for Endocrinology recommends up to 4,000 units a day without medical supervision. But there are some that take up to 10,000. There was a study in Canada where someone was taking 10 to 20,000 units a day for up to a year. And again, no issues with toxicity. So these are where the studies are, and we can get into some of those as we go on. So what is the observational and interventional studies? Again, we're going to sort of go over this in a non-COVID situation. Here's a study that looked at almost 10,000 Germans, 50 to 75 years of age. It was prospective, it was observational, and it was a 15-year follow-up. So that's a very long follow-up. And again, remember, this is nanomoles per liter, so divide this by 2.5 to get to your nanograms per milliliter. But again, here we'd be looking at approximately, around 50 for our cutoff here, if we're looking at 20 nanograms per milliliter. And you can see here that there's a large portion of the German population, at least, that have either deficient or insufficient vitamin D. That is certainly a problem. And when they looked at these patients over the next 15 years, what they found was astonishing in that when they looked at mortality from respiratory issues, they found that there was a statistical significant difference in mortality from respiratory issues. And you can see here that 50 at the top, 30 to 50 in the middle, and that less than 30 at the bottom. So certainly, definitely observationally, vitamin D makes a difference. And of course, everyone knows this study. This was the big meta-analysis that was published in the British Medical Journal by Martineau. And it showed, looking at 25 different observational studies, looking at interventional studies, they were to find that small, regular, daily doses of vitamin D reduced respiratory tract infections. And we've talked about that. James went over that, so we'll move on. Here's another study, though, that you may not have known about. This was a randomized controlled study that was done in Japan back about 10 years ago. And what they decided to do was they randomized 1,200 international units of vitamin D versus placebo in school-aged children over a winter season. And they actually swabbed them to check for influenza A. And they found that the incidence of influenza A went from 18.6% in the placebo down to 10.8% in the intervention group. So the number needed to treat there was 13, and you could prevent one bout of influenza A just by supplementing at a modest dose of 1,200 international units a day. Okay, so let's look at vitamin D itself. So vitamin D deficiency, how does it look biochemically, and compare it to how COVID-19 looks? Well, both have increased IL-6 levels. Both have tumor necrosis factor alpha levels. Both have interferon elevation late in the course of COVID-19. Late in the course of COVID-19, we also see a Th1 adaptive response, which we also see in vitamin D deficiency. And as was mentioned by James, ACE2 expression is reduced. And believe it or not, hypercoagulability is seen in in vitamin D deficiencies. So it's kind of interesting. Vitamin D deficiency and its key signature biochemical pattern is reproduced in COVID-19. All right, what about epidemiological evidence from COVID-19 patients? Remember those three things that were associated with at the beginning: age, race, and obesity? Well, take a look here. We know that in COVID-19, as you get older, and again, here to the right of this line, you're going to see a much higher increased risk for COVID-19. And that was very, very largely associated with age. Here we see with obesity, the more obese they are, the higher the risk. And again, with ethnicity as well. So again, COVID-19 is behaving exactly as we would expect it would if we had vitamin D as its causative factor, or at least one of them. Let's look at some epidemiological studies, look at mortality. So we know that you need sunlight to have vitamin D. This study looked at the latitude from the equator and showed that for every degree north of the equator, there was an increase in mortality. You can see here in this graph, starting at 0 degrees and going up, once it hit above 35, there was an increase in mortality. And you can see some of these countries. The average mortality for COVID-19 was correlated with where they sat on the map. I think that's very, very telling there. Another study looked at this time with a number of countries, 20 European countries, most of which are above the 35th parallel. And they looked at the average vitamin D levels. They looked at COVID-19 cases, and they looked at COVID-19 disease mortality. And you can see here with cases, again, this is nanomoles per liter. So again, divide by 2.5 to get back to nanograms per milliliter. Clearly, the lower the vitamin D level, the higher the amount of cases in these European countries. I think that was very interesting. And the same thing held true for mortality. Again, the lower the vitamin D levels, and it seems like even here looking at 60 or 70, so this would be a nanogram per milliliter dose around 20 to 30, you see an increase in mortality in these European countries. All right, let's talk about epidemiological studies comparing vitamin D with SARS-CoV infection. So here we have in Switzerland a study of 107 patients, And what they found was that in those that were PCR negative, there was a higher 25 hydroxy vitamin D level, nanograms per milliliter, than there was in those that were PCR positive. And that was statistically significant. But there is something to be aware of, and that is that it's possible. We're looking at COVID. When you measure vitamin D levels acutely in people coming into the hospital, one could say theoretically it could be the COVID that's reducing the vitamin D level, and that's why the vitamin D levels are lower in patients with COVID in the hospital. And actually, they did a study on that. This was a letter to the editor titled Vitamin D Deficiency in COVID-19, Mixing Up the Cause and the Consequence. In 9 patients, they gave LPS, with lipopolysaccharide, which is a substance that induces an immune response. And yes, sure enough, they found that in terms of nanomoles per liter, which is an inflated number, a higher number, that there was a very modest decrease in vitamin D levels. So you have to be careful when you look at acute vitamin D levels in patients with COVID-19. I think a more robust way of looking at it is to look back in the last few months prior to their hospitalization for COVID-19 to see what their vitamin D levels were in that case. So something to keep in mind going forward. And that's exactly what they did here. This was an Israeli study that they looked at, and they were able to find about 14,000 subjects, 6,000 of which did not have prior vitamin D levels, 7,000 which did, and they basically divided them out into COVID positive and COVID negative subjects. And the first thing I want to show you here is this scattergram with age on the y-axis and vitamin D levels on the x-axis. The first thing I want you to notice here is that there's a big gap up here in the upper right-hand corner. What does that mean? What does that tell you? It tells you that it's very rare for people who are advanced in age to have super duper vitamin D levels. Okay, so that is a big risk there. The other thing I want you to look at here is the flow chart for where these patients went. This first bar graph is vitamin D level. So high vitamin D levels on the right side of this graph and low vitamin D levels on the left side. Then we filter them through the age, and then we filter them through whether or not they were positive for COVID-19. Here's the take-home point that I want you to see. I want you to notice that very few purple lines come into this COVID-19 box. Where are the purple lines coming from? High vitamin D levels. So you can see that it's very, very rare for anybody, whether they're very young, whether they're middle-aged, or whether they're advanced in age. Regardless of age, it's very rare to have someone with high vitamin D levels come down with COVID-19. I think that's one of the take-home points of this study. And again, when they looked at these 25 hydroxy vitamin D levels, by the way, this is nanomoles per liter. So again, divide this by 2.5 to get the, nanomoles per liter, divided by 2.5 to get the nanograms per milliliter, which is what we usually deal with. What happens there is if you have a level that is lower, then you are at 1.45 odds ratio risk of getting infection and 1.95 risk of getting hospitalization. Again, these are vitamin D levels well prior to admission. So we can't have that possibility of COVID reducing these numbers. So I think that's an important distinction here that we need to make sure that we're aware of. Here's another study that was published again. This was the link between vitamin D deficiency in a very large population. Again, you can see here SARS-CoV-2 positivity is shifted to the left towards lower vitamin D levels, especially males here on the top, but even more so in females here at the bottom. Vitamin D levels seem to be the problem. All right, now what about, this is one of my favorite studies because it's really, really nice. Although it is a retrospective observational analysis, looking at, though, 191,000 patients in the United States, looking at SARS-CoV-2 and vitamin D levels. And check this out. Nanograms per milliliter Clearly, as you start to get lower vitamin D levels, the SARS-CoV-2 positive rate goes up. I'm not talking about hospitalization. I'm not talking about COVID-19. I'm talking about how likely is it for you to get an infection. That's really important. And now notice, this is not a relationship that's isolated when we pool everything together. Even when we break it down into geography, northern versus central versus southern, race, black, Hispanic, white, age, gender, sex, it doesn't matter. This relationship holds true all throughout, that lower 25 hydroxy vitamin D levels lead to higher SARS-CoV-2 positive rates. All right, what about course progression? Do people get worse? So here was a study that was published looking at 105 patients where now, again, vitamin D was drawn acutely, so we have to be careful here. SARS-CoV-2 negative, 33.3%. SARS-CoV-2 positive, 66.7%. And of those patients who had positive SARS-CoV-2, they broke it down to see whether or not they had high vitamin D levels or low vitamin D levels. Those with low vitamin D levels had higher D dimers peaking, and that's usually associated with thrombosis, and had more ventilator requirement days. So in other words, vitamin D on admission to the hospital, those levels could be predictive of how bad of a course they might have. Here's another study that was done looking at vitamin D deficiency and outcome. So this is important to look at. And again, looking at nanograms per milliliter. Here we have survivability in these patients. Here's what it looks like if you make the cutoff at 12 nanograms per milliliter, statistically significant worsening survival. Here's what it looks like if you cut it off at 20 nanograms per milliliter, statistically significant difference in survival. Okay, but up to this point, we've all showed a very, very, very strong association between vitamin D and COVID-19 testing positive, going to the hospital, worse prognosis. But whenever you do observational and associated and retrospective studies, you can never make the claim of causation, right? Because association does not mean causation. That's the first thing that we learn in medical school when we take our epidemiology classes. So how do you parse that out? You look at randomized controlled trials. So as James talked to us about, here was this study, and rightfully so, he pointed out that maybe this was overstated because of some problems in the randomization. But nevertheless, what were the chances of you going to the intensive care unit if you were taking placebo? It was 50%. What were the chances in this group of going to the intensive care unit if you were on calcifediol? Now, calcifediol is the name that we give to 25 hydroxy vitamin D. Remember now that 25 hydroxy vitamin D is the byproduct of vitamin D going through the liver, which takes some time to be metabolized, and then you get 25 hydroxy vitamin D. So when you take vitamin D, when you get sun exposure, it takes a little time to metabolize that to 25 hydroxy vitamin D. What these Spanish investigators were doing was they were giving it directly, so it did not have to pass through the liver. And what we saw here was a dramatic improvement in this study. And I believe they are doing a larger study with much more subjects, obviously, in the study to parse this out. Well, here's another study that I found really interesting. In the south of France, what they would do to patients in nursing homes, very smartly, is they would give 80,000 international units of vitamin D every 3 months to these patients. So when these patients started to go to the hospital with COVID-19, they asked this question: hey, have you gotten your 80,000 units within the last month, or has it been more than a month? And they plotted out survival. And those subjects involved in the study, those subjects from the nursing home that had their shot within the last month, had a much better survival than those that had gotten their shot or their supplementation more than a month away. So I think that was an interesting study. Maybe they ought to be giving a lesser dose, perhaps more frequently. That may be one of the results of that study. James did talk about this study. This was the study in Brazil. That quote was a negative study. I think James pointed that out very well. There were some problems with the randomization. The other thing I was going to mention too is they gave one dose, one bolus dose. And if there's one thing in the British Medical Journal publication way back that looked at that meta-analysis, they said that the thing that worked the least was a large bolus dose. in prevention disease. Of course, this is trying to treat disease. And we know that antibiotics work for bacterial infections, and we don't give a huge bolus dose of an antibiotic on day 1 and hope that it works for 7 days. So I think I agree with James on this completely, that what this study shows is that this is not the way we should treat people with vitamin D, perhaps. Let's see here. Next one. The SHADE study, James talked about already. I thought it was an interesting study. I am actually, we can't get 60,000 international units of vitamin D here in the United States, or at least at my hospital. We have 50,000. And I'll tell you, I am currently giving this to my patients in the hospital with COVID-19. 50,000 units daily for 7 days. I'm doing just about exactly what they did in this SHADE study, and I'm hopeful that it's going to be beneficial. We'll need some more studies. Just wrapping up here briefly, I included this here at the end only because it was published just recently, as well as the SHADE study. And what they did in India as well, the SHADE study was from India as well, is they had a place in their hospital for patients that didn't need necessarily acute hospitalization, but they could take care of them. And so when they admitted these patients, they admitted those that needed sort of a kind of nursing home level of care in Group A. They were the asymptomatic, if you will, population. They stayed that way for at least 12 days. Group B were the ones that needed to be admitted because they were sicker. So when they compared Group A to Group B, A being asymptomatic and B being really bad, if you want to remember it that way, that the patients in the asymptomatic group had levels of vitamin D, had more people with levels greater than 20. And of course, Group B had more people with levels less than 20. Well, when they parsed those out and they looked at those vitamin D levels, guess what? The ones with lower vitamin D levels had higher IL-6. They almost statistically significantly had higher TNF alpha levels, and they had higher serum ferritin levels. And that's what we're tracking now in our patients with COVID-19 to see for basically their prognosis and how much inflammation is going on in the body. So I wanted to also show you, by the way, that there was a fatality differential on that as well, 3.1 versus 21 in the low vitamin D group versus the normal vitamin D group. And that led the authors to say all this translates into increased mortality in vitamin D deficient COVID-19 patients. As per the flexible approach in the current COVID-19 pandemic, authors recommend mass administration of vitamin D supplements to populations at risk for COVID-19. Last thing here I wanted to state here is, what about fortification in food products? And I just wanted to end with this quote. First of all, show you that in places like Finland, it's voluntary, but everybody does it. In Norway, it's voluntary, just about everybody does it. In Canada, it's mandatory. It's actually regulated. In the United States, it's voluntary, and we have some issues. Let me tell you about, real quickly, and then we'll be done, Ireland. Here's a position piece, someone in Ireland, where they do not have mandatory vitamin D supplementation. This is what he says. This is Kenny Laird. Ireland does not have any formal vitamin D policy. We practice a voluntary but not a mandatory food fortification policy where food manufacturers can decide to fortify or not their food products with vitamin D. The vitamin D status of those in Ireland is lower than that in the United States or Canada, who have systematic mass vitamin D fortification. However, vitamin D deficiency is not inevitable in older adults in Ireland, and the ability to have sufficient vitamin D status year-round is an achievable goal that many countries meet. For example, another European country, Finland, which is at a much higher latitude and therefore receives less sunshine than Ireland, has virtually eliminated vitamin D deficiency in its population with rates less than 1%. This is due in part to a successful food fortification and vitamin D supplementation policy and educating the public and medical practitioners of the importance of vitamin D. This vitamin D success story demonstrates what could be achieved in Ireland. And I say this also demonstrates what could be achieved here in the United States and around the world. And with that, I will conclude my talk and listen for some more interesting talks here.
Roger, I can't thank you enough, and James both, for being able to take all this amazing information and consolidate it in a way that's so attainable and useful to our audience, and from your lips to FDA's ears, please. So I also really appreciate the fact that this makes it all more real for everyone who's on the call in terms of what we can achieve next, and what it's like to be on the front lines with just being in the hospital is a really interesting perspective too to share. Oops, So, and with that, I am really pleased. Okay, let's just fast fingers here. I'm really pleased to be able to introduce Dr. Gaither. Dr. Keisha Gaither is a double board certified physician in the OBGYN department and maternal fetal medicine. She currently serves as director of perinatal services for NYC's Hospital and Health Lincoln. And Dr. Gaither has been named America's top obstetrician and gynecologist by the Consumer Research Council in 07, 10, 12, 13, 14, and 15. We're honored to have Dr. Gaither as a member of our Science Advisory Council as well. And Dr. Gaither, I look forward to your commentary. She's been actively engaged in our campaign around vitamin D and consumer education, and certainly all the work that we've done with preterm birth and vitamin D. Dr. Gaither, lives it every day. So I turn this over to you.
Hello and good afternoon, everybody. I want to thank Mrs. Howard for inviting me to this venue. It certainly is an important venue to promote education. So let me just tell you a little bit about what I do. I'm a maternal fetal medicine specialist, which means that I take care of all of those pregnancies that are deemed high risk, diabetics, multiples, people with HIV, and so forth. So for us in the perinatal arena, COVID has proved to be a very formidable foe. To date, there really isn't anything in the literature that clearly defines how COVID can interact on the maternal fetal dyad. We are unsure as to how it is transmitted to the fetus. If it is transmitted to the fetus, how does that happen? So there are a lot of things that we don't know. Does the fetus get it during the traverse through the birth canal? Does the fetus get it through breast milk? How are these things done? So at this point in time, we really don't know. We're really in the dark, and we're relying on case reports and information from various parts of the world. Having said that, let's talk about the pathophysiology of pregnancy. Pregnancy in and of itself confers a decreased immunity. The immune system has to depress itself to allow the fetus, which really the body considers as a foreign body, to thrive and survive. So at the start, a pregnant woman is at a particular deficit when it comes to being pregnant and being in the state of COVID pandemic as we see it. Secondly, the way in which your body changes during the course of pregnancy. The gravid uterus elevates in the abdomen, compresses the lung function is depressed. Now, being on the front line and certainly being at Lincoln Hospital in the Bronx, which is the epicenter really in New York, has been more of an experience that I'm sure most of us would want to contend with. But be that as it may, having said that, there are some things that I have taken from this. First and foremost, I think that being diabetic and pregnant is a recipe for disaster. If there are pregnant women listening at this point in time, I think the best thing that you can gain from my conversation is to ensure that you are well controlled, okay? COVID seems to really like pregnant diabetics and those that are poorly controlled. My losses, all the deaths that I've had in the patients that I've cared for have been poorly controlled diabetics. Now, with that being said, so what do we have in our armamentarium? Vitamin D, and I'm an avid lover of vitamin D, it confers a lot of great things for the body, and particularly for the body that's pregnant. Vitamin D is important in cardiovascular function. Vitamin D is important certainly in bone development, not only for you as an adult, but certainly for the growing fetus. Vitamin D has been shown to have some really beneficial effects in diminishing the incidence of preterm labor in pregnant patients. Now, for pregnant patients with COVID, vitamin D has, I feel, proven to be of great benefit in that it boosts immune function. And certainly in a pregnant woman who already has immunologic incompetence due to the pregnancy in and of itself, and certainly if she's diabetic, which is a further state of inflammation, decreasing your immunity, to take vitamin D while you're pregnant is a great thing. Vitamin D is inexpensive. Vitamin D is readily available. And with that being said, I think that it is an important adjunct to any prenatal vitamin that you are taking. I usually give my patients 1,000 to 2,000 IUs daily. Now, being on the front line, there are a lot of changes from a perinatal perspective that any pregnant woman should expect during the course of her prenatal care. First and foremost is how your appointments are going to be made, okay? In order to decrease the amount of people in the wait room, you can expect that the times for appointments will be staggered. And they're staggered to decrease the amount of people that are in the waiting room, okay? You can expect to see all the healthcare providers in PPE, masks and, visors and gowns and so forth and so on. That should be an expectation. When it comes to ultrasounds being done, while we have in the past, prior to COVID, allowed everybody in the room to see baby's first picture, expect that goodie is kind of going to be limited, okay? And we do that simply because we don't want a whole lot of traffic of people back and forth within the suite to decrease the incidence of people contracting the virus. Expect that when you go on labor and delivery, there is going to be a difference. There's going to be a difference in who is allowed in the room with the patient. Certainly one person will be allowed, the father of the baby. Father of the baby will be in full PPE. You should expect to see everybody in full PPE. Once the baby is born, then for most hospitals, there's nobody allowed on the postpartum ward. It's just mom and baby. So those are all things that should be expected. Now, one thing that I usually like to add to that equation is what happens when you get home with your newborn. Certainly, it has been advised that you limit the individuals that are around your newborn. Having the whole family over to see the baby and so forth and so on is probably not the best of ideas. So with that being said, for all of my other ladies undergoing their perinatal care, I want you to do the same things. I want you to social distance. It's important that you wash your hands really good. It's important that you wear your mask. And certainly it is more than important that you take your vitamin D, because vitamin D really has a lot of great benefits for the maternal fetal dyad. So with that, I am going to bid you all adieu. I'm going to wait around in the event that there are any questions that anybody from the audience has concerning pregnancy, COVID, and vitamin D. Thank you.
Dr. Gaither, applause, and thank you for being here and doing this, but mostly for taking time from your day and your patients and being there for them. It really is a pleasure.
Thank you
and an
so
honor.
much. Thank you.
So this is really a good segue into my final comments, which is essentially about, taking effective action and how we can make this more accessible to people, this information that we, one, are all fairly familiar with, two, write about quite often, three, tell all of our family and drive them nuts, but how do we systemically get this out into the workplace? So in just the day-to-day lives of all the people that we can affect one by one. And most of you are probably aware that Organic and Natural Health, which is a rather unique trade association, and then it represents the entirety of the supply chain, from raw ingredients to consumer organizations, the retailers and the brands in between, is really committed to providing consumers with what it is they want and what it is they need. So we started doing a vitamin D education campaign as sort of a result of our collaboration with Grassroots Health, several studies of which you saw referenced today, about 4 years ago. And essentially what we've done this time is taken it to a new level, because the level of urgency that COVID-19 has brought to the table, especially in relationship to those who are Latin American and African American, is dramatic. And as such, we created a campaign, a media campaign called Get On My Level. So I'm just going to let this campaign speak for itself. You can watch an interview with our spokesperson, Dr. Red Cross, with an Atlanta reporter.
Hello and welcome back to Focus Atlanta. Again, I am your host, Keisha Lance-Lynn. Thank you so much for tuning in. We're going to talk a little bit about your health and your vitamin D level. I'm here with Dr. Ken Red Cross. Dr. Red Cross, thank you so much for coming back on Focus Atlanta. It's a pleasure to see you.
Oh, it's even better to be here. I wish it could be in person, but that's all right. We'll try this again in some months or years to come.
That's right. That's right. This time, though, you have come to, continually you come on to give us some education. And I'm really excited about this. You read articles about which vitamins you need to be taking for which things help your immunity system and what helps what. And all of us are kind of missing out on the vitamin D. Tell me a little bit about the importance of vitamin D for us.
Okay, so thank you for that. So Keisha, for those who may not know, so I'm a practicing internal medicine physician. So I'm Western trained, Keisha. But everyone, I've kind of seen the light, and I realized that there's alternative ways of healing that we need to be really incorporating, especially into our community. Now, we all know the vitamin D story. We all know it's for the bones and that sort of thing, but that's the old story on vitamin D, Keisha, because now, to your point, we're learning about vitamin D's importance for our immune system. And so there's a lot of interesting things that we've learned about vitamin D recently that really allows us all to kind of start listening and incorporating it more into our diet.
And I love that, because I think that we take it for granted because we feel like if we go outside and get a little sunshine, okay, we're fine. Yeah. But no, we should be looking for it in the things that we eat. We should be looking for it in different ways. Tell me a little bit more.
So I should actually retract that a little bit when I said a little bit of vitamin D in our diet. What I meant by that, everyone, was really thinking about it as supplementation into our diet. And let me explain why. So vitamin D is something, Keisha, that's not particularly rampant in our diet. In other words, where everyone will think about milk, but milk is fortified with vitamin D, meaning that it's added fatty fish livers such as sardines and that sort of things. Not everyone's favorite. But loaded with vitamin D as well, but it's something that's not really in our diets. Therefore, we have to think about supplementing, especially when you have brown skin, like our beautiful skin. As beautiful as it is, it blocks out the rays of the sun. And so therefore, for us and Latinos, it's the same in that because of our melanin in our skin, since it blocks out the rays of the sun, we tend to be deficient. And that's African Americans about 80% and Latinos a little under 70%. So why is that important, Keisha? Because when you look at the 3 or 4 disease states that are associated with the coronavirus, you look at the fact that those who are diabetics, obese, heart disease, lung disease, all of those states have been shown in studies to also be low in vitamin D. And marry that with the fact that African Americans are also low in vitamin D, Keisha, it's a story that we're starting to learn more and more about, especially in our community, in the Latino community, why vitamin D is so important. So it's an exciting time when you think about it.
So if we can get the supplements that we need, what should we be looking for? Because, that's the other thing. We get into that aisle in the grocery store or the health food store, and we don't even really know what we're looking for, Dr. Red Cross. Right. I'm just going to tell you the truth.
Right. The truth will set you free. It's okay. It's okay. So I'll tell you, everyone. So look, the important thing is this. One of the big things and to be on the show today is to make sure that I want each and every one out there, and even if you're not African-American or Latino, I want you to know your levels. I want you to, as I've been saying lately, get on my level. And what does that mean? I want your vitamin D level to be between 40 and 60, but you have to get it checked. There's 2 ways to do it. You could try to get to your doctor's office, which I know has been a big challenge for everyone, especially with COVID. But the way that I talk to a lot of patients about is really going on a website called thepowerofd.org. Now, I mentioned thepowerofd.org for a couple of reasons, everyone. If you go to there, you can order an at-home test kit. So a lot of us are already familiar with doing a finger stick if you're diabetic or grandmas and that sort of thing. Well, this is a finger stick test as well. So if you go to thepowerofd.org, not only can you order a test kit, but you can also get your results, put the results into their calculator, and it'll tell you how much vitamin D you should be taking as well. Now, if someone puts my feet to the fire and says, well, Dr. Red Cross, I was in the barbershop yesterday, kind of educating everybody, socially distanced with mask. But I was letting them know that that sweet spot tends to be between 2,000 and 5,000. And quite honestly, 5,000 is a good level to be at when you're thinking about getting a good amount of vitamin D3 when you're looking over the counter to see what you can do to really keep your health up and optimal.
Thank you so much for all that. You always bring us such good information when you come on Focus Atlanta. That's why I can't wait till the world opens up and you can come back in studio.
Oh, I can't wait.
Sit down again, talk about some more stuff. Thank you for your time.
Oh, thank you so much for having me. And everyone, please reach out and say hello. I love answering questions and meeting new people. And you could do that whether it be at any of my social media handles, which are all at drkenredcross.com or at Dr. Ken Red Cross.
All right, guys, visit Dr. Ken Red Cross on social media and go to the website to find out what your vitamin D levels are. You want to find out what that might be, to find out what you might need. So many of us take these things for granted, right? Well, we've learned that there's no
So I think you'll agree, Ken does a lovely job of addressing these issues. And one of the questions that actually came up during the session was, what about amounts? And now one of the things that Organic and Natural is really firmly established on is that you need to know the amount of your level before you start just randomly taking vitamin D, although please randomly take it if you haven't been, right? So I should also point out that there's a calculator on the website that helps you if you do know your vitamin D level and what you're taking to be able to adjust that. So these are the messages that we have effectively over the last 4 months been able to share with this target audience and are now in our final throes of the fundraising efforts, which is the commercial at the end of this that says, you know, this is criminal that this message is not in the hands of every consumer in this country. So I share our success with you. I welcome you all to the fold to be able to participate in this campaign, make contributions, and share the word, share the social media. This is something that's too important not to make public and well known, to which I suspect Mr. Harrison has a comment he would like to make before we close. And I don't believe I saw any questions that we hadn't answered.
Thank you, Karen. I want to leave everybody with this thought. It was like last year at this time, we had, or 2 years ago at this time, we had filed a petition with FDA regarding vitamin D and preterm birth. We had a follow-up meeting with FDA. Even though we had a very extensive study out of South Carolina looking at the benefits of bringing up vitamin D levels in women who had low vitamin D levels, FDA looked at us skeptically, and their lead person, scientist on the matter, sat there and said, well, how do you know that the vitamin D levels were not caused, increase in vitamin D levels were not caused by the sun? I looked puzzled for a second, and then I said, well, this study was mainly done in poor working class women who generally were minorities. I don't think they were out in the South Carolina summer sun sunbathing to increase their vitamin D levels. I sense that lacks common sense. The response to me was, science does not recognize common sense, which is the exact problem with science today. You follow the science that you believe in. You don't follow science. The fact of the matter is there's very few laws of science. Almost everything is a shade of gray. Unfortunately, the Federal Trade Commission, the FDA, CDC, NIH, our state governments are refusing to see the gray areas. I urge everyone here, contact your congressman. Why isn't this information being let out to the general public. It could be life-saving. No, we're not saying it's a silver bullet, but it is another tool in our tool shed that can help us fight a pandemic, because we don't know whether this vaccine will be something that lasts for more than a year. Maybe something we'll have to have every year or two. And while it looks like it's safe now, as my 17-year-old son pointed out to me, Dad, we really won't know the safety of these vaccines for another 4 to 5 years. And he's absolutely correct on that. We are all going to take a leap of faith that these vaccines will help. But in the end, the studies are too short at this time. We don't know. And again, there are things that we can add to our arsenal. We're not telling people not to get vaccines. We're not telling people not to take drugs. What we're telling people is this: nutritional status matters. And it is time we change the paradigm. It is time that we rise up and explain to our federal officials that science is not what you think it is. And that the science actually, if you look at it from a common sense approach, as opposed to double-blind placebo-controlled study approach, which actually would also support our position, that common sense just tells you that vitamin D status matters. As was pointed out early on, what population groups tend to be the worst hit off? Those who tend to be deficient in vitamin D. That says a lot. This is information that needs to go out to everybody, and we need to start raising our voices. And this organization is committed to bring this information to the public. We will be ridiculed at times, but we will not be stopped. Our nutritional and health status matters in any fight against any disease, including the pandemic that we face now. So get out there, make your voices known, tell your congressman, write FDA, write the Federal Trade Commission. Why are you telling people not to let this information out? Tell your mainstream news media, why aren't you letting this information out? Why do you give it short shrift? What makes you so certain you're right? It is time that it gets a fair airing as opposed to a biased airing. And that's what I'll end with today, Karen. You're on mute.
Thank you, Todd. Very well stated. Caught myself. Great thank you to you and Venable for supporting this outreach. Doctors Gaither, DeNicolantonio, Roger, I can't thank you enough for everything that you have done to make this happen today, all the work that you put into it all the time, and taking time away from all the valuable things you do. And to our audience, as you heard, we need people to get the word. So thank you for being a part of that. Have a great day and go buy some vitamin D.